I've recently been looking at biblical genealogies. In a video last week, we went down the rabbit hole of Genesis 5's genealogies, specifically looking at the ages of the antediluvians and their relationship to astronomical periods. My recent interest in this topic has been because I've been studying the book of Chronicles, the first 9 chapters of which are genealogies. So rather than go name by name with a fine comb, we're just going to look broadly at the surprisingly dense theology that's packed into the various genealogies that are found in the Bible. And not just in the content, but even in the structure. The structure reveals God's unseen hands and how they work throughout the biblical story. So let's put Solomon in the corner here. And we're going to start off with a lengthy quote from Peter Leithart's Chronicles commentary on pages 10 and 11. He writes, "Priests have status only because they are genetically linked with Aaron, then Zadok. For the writer of Hebrews, this is a sign of the preliminary character of the Old Covenant, its fleshliness. Though biblical genealogies identify humanity's or Israel's roots, they are fundamentally about looking forward. The key term in the genealogies of Genesis is generations, or toledoth." I do want to point this out, that this idea of looking forward, this is all over the Bible. In the very beginning, in creation, you have the phrase that's repeated, evening. There was evening and then morning. Even in something like that, you have the old giving way to the new. It's eschatological. Everything is moving forward. You don't have, like in the pagan sense, this cyclic nature where everything's just pure cycles. God does operate in certain patterns, but it's not the same thing happening over and over. New things are happening. God is always moving into something new. But you get that with things as simple as the evening and morning, but you get this even with things like genealogies. So continuing on, the toledoth of Adam in Genesis 5:1 does not trace Adam's roots, but Adam's fruit, what he begets. In Chronicles 2, toledoth describes chiefs and heads according to generations, that is, according to what they produce. Biblical genealogies lean eschatologically, not protologically. One hint of this future orientation is the repeated phrase, heads of the fathers' households, for example, in 1 Chronicles 5:15, or more startlingly, heads of the fathers. That's 1 Chronicles 8:6, and that's the author's translation. In the chronicler's view, a son does not merely become head of his father's house after his father has died. Sons are described as heads of the fathers themselves. In normal reckoning, fathers are, of course, prior to sons. But the phrase hints at the son's priority to, or the equality with, the one who begets him. The sons are not merely extensions of their fathers. They are heads of the fathers, crowning their fathers with glory as mighty men of valor. Sons secure their father's paternal name. Without begotten sons, fathers would not be begetters. Sons make fathers fathers. This can be stated Christologically. Biblical genealogies trace a line of descent from the first Adam to the last Adam. Genealogies end with Matthew and Luke. Fleshly qualification for priesthood or kingship or covenant membership gives way to the indestructible power of the risen priest king after the order of Melchizedek. That's Hebrews 7. Abram's standing is finally founded not in his ancestry, but in his descendant, and being forefather of the ultimate seed, Jesus. Jesus, the son of Abram, is head of the Father. Insofar as the genealogies are oriented towards the Messiah, they are oriented to the future rather than the past. It is the future that secures the past, rather than vice versa. More speculatively, the point can be stated Trinitarianly. The Father is only Father by eternal generation of the Son. Without the Son, the Father is barren and unfruitful, without toledoth. The Father is head of the Son, 1 Chronicles 11:3. Yet the Son is, in the chronicler's sense, head of his Father, the filial source of the Father's paternity. And this kind of gets into some pretty deep philosophical discussion about monotheism and things like that, because you run into this problem if you ever looked at it in things like Islam. Now, in Islam, we don't have a father-son relationship with God. The best you could have in Islam is a master-servant relationship. But that issue aside, you can't speak of Allah being eternally any number of things, because they would require someone else to be eternally those things with. So the Trinitarian position, the Trinitarian dogma, solves that problem, if you will, that you can have God in personal relationships and still be one because you have one essence, multiple persons. So the persons can interact with each other in loving ways and things like that, and then therefore be eternally those things. But that gets into heavy philosophical stuff, and that's frankly beyond what I do. But I know that that is an issue that comes up in philosophy, for instance. Continuing with Lightheart's commentary in page 12, he follows a number of commentators here who argue that the genealogies themselves have a chiastic structure. And if you don't know what chiasms are, they are basically, it's basically like the letter X, right? So it's this intersecting type pattern. One of the simplest ones I can think of is in Matthew 23 when Jesus says, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So you have exalting, humbling, humble, exalt. So you have these themes kind of interact and intersect with each other. So here you have in A, you have the tribes, or before there were tribes, you have these peoples. And then A prime down here mirroring this at the end of the section in chapter 9, you have a new Israel after the exile. B, you have the royal tribe of Judah. B prime, here at the bottom, you have the royal tribe of Benjamin. And notice how these chapters are moving up. So if we were reading the book, we'd just read it straight down the line. But if you notice, these elements match up. So A goes with A, B goes with B prime. C, you have the peripheral tribes. C prime, you have, again, other peripheral tribes. But what this means is the center is often the point or the most, the focal point of the narrative, whatever it is. And here it's the Levites. And this is really essential to the chronicler's theology of the Levites being very important because of their association with the temple and with worship and the liturgy, all that kind of stuff. So that he would place them in the center is very meaningful. Here, Eugene Merrill, in his commentary on page 82, has something we'll just pick up on. He says, Abram is the 10th generation from Shem, just as Shem's father, Noah, was the 10th generation from Adam. This is actually important. We'll hit this point again here in a moment, but we could say that almost in the reverse, that Adam was 10 generations from Noah, Noah was 10 generations from Abraham, or Abraham was 20 generations from Adam. Again, like I said, this will become important. We'll make an observation on this point. Continue with Merrill. The numbers 3, 7, and 10 provide evidence of the highly stylized and formulaic nature of the genealogical method, and more important, of the message of the Old Testament. Features most apparent in the scheme of the chronicler and even the gospel writers. And here he has a footnote, but I want to zero in on this. We're going to do a lot here in a moment. This right here is a bit of an understatement because we're going to find it's extremely stylized and that a lot of structure goes on in that. But kind of as a transition point to that, in his footnote, he notes this. The most noteworthy is the 14-14-14 pattern of Matthew 1, reflecting the 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to the Babylonian exile, and from the exile to the birth of Jesus Christ. This clearly relates to the Old Testament tradition of the significance of the number 7, here doubled for each historical section. With that in mind, we're going to transition over into Fletcher Lewis's book, where he interacts a bit with Labuschagne's work. And if you've ever studied Matthew's genealogy or read a commentary on Matthew, you'll note, or they'll note, that 14-14-14 pattern. And many will point out that 14 is the value in Hebrew Gomatria of David's name. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Gomatria, it's a little more sophisticated than A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3. On some levels of it, it is that simple. You just go 1 to 22, and they have 22 letters in the alphabet, and you just count it that way. But it can get more complex than this, especially once you get to the number 11, or the 11th letter, because from there either becomes 11, or you do 1 plus 1 equals 2, then you multiply it by 10. So that becomes 20. And then the 12th letter is either a 12 or it's a 30, 13 or 40, 14 or 50, and you go that way until all through the list. Now, we don't need any of the numbers beyond that point, so it's pretty simple for what we're doing here. But basically understand it's the numerical value of the letter. And so therefore words or names had a numerical value themselves. And so when we look at the numerical value of David's name, it is 14. Now, a lot of commentators are going to dismiss this and say, well, we don't know that they did Gomatria at the time. Now, I think that that's kind of nonsense for the reasons that we're about to go through. As Fletcher Lewis actually notes here, Labuschagne has pointed out that the organizing numerical principle in Matthew 1 is already present in Psalm 3, the first Psalm of David in the Psalter. That's really significant because if you're going to argue they didn't do it, well, it's there in the Psalms. And that's not the only one. Actually, the other Psalms of David, according to Labuschagne, have this. A lot of them have this 14 numerical structure to it, kind of almost like as a signature, saying this is a Psalm of David, right? To have his number embedded in the Psalm itself. And another thing, in addition to this, just a little bit on Matthew's genealogy, most commentators will note that you do have this 14, 14, 14 structure equals 42, but it's a little bit artificial how Matthew gets there. He really wants that triple 14, but he kind of has to fudge things a little bit to get there. Because there's kind of this question of, is it 41? Is it 42 generations? Like, how does this work? But Labuschagne, in another article, he pointed out that 41 happens to be the value of Abraham. Or Abram, I forget which. I think it's Abraham. But that would mean that then 41 would signal Abraham, 42, or the triple David, would bring to mind David. So even though the genealogy is bluntly saying that Jesus is the son of Abraham and the son of David, just the way it's structured is also saying that same thing. Jesus is 41, but he's also a 14. But continuing further on, this is the part that we want to get to. This is what's going to become relevant to our genealogies. So the name, the divine name, Yahweh, to be, has this numerical value of 26. So it's Yod-He, Vav-He, and it's 10, 5, 6, 5, 26. There's another method of counting that removes the zeros, and that becomes 1, 5, 6, 5 equals 17. But Labuschagne suggests that the Hebrew for I am, which would replace the Yod with a Aleph, gives us 1, 5, 6, 5, 17. So just pause here and follow this. The divine name, Yahweh, either is numerically 17 or 26. The number 17 is important in its own right because it is the seventh prime number. Both 26 and 17 are also attained by adding the numerical values of the Hebrew word for glory. That is the term kavod down here. And here he gives the math how you would get there. So it's 11 plus 2 plus 4, 17, or 20 plus 2 plus 4, 26. Thus, the numbers 17 and 26 signified both the name of God and God's own divine glory, indeed, implying an identification between God's name and his glory. And there are other verses that could be added to this point. The appearance of patterns and blocks of 17 or 26 words in the literary structure of a text then creates a divine watermark, reminding the attentive reader of God's presence through his revealed word and in other ways. I have a different video where I talk about this, as he's going to go on in this article and point out that this pops up in the New Testament in kind of one of these early creedal hymn type things about Jesus. So you can check that video out where I go deeper into that. But I go through this article very quickly to make the point that 17 and 26 often structure texts. In fact, Psalm 23 is one of my favorite examples of this. And this is from Labuschagne. And he points out here that there's 55 total words in Psalm 23. So the arithmetic center of the poem is constituted by the three words in verse 4d, which is its meaningful center on a word level. So there's 55 words, meaning there's 26 words, the center of Psalm 23, and then 26 more words. That center is for you are with me. So you have 26 words, a divine number, you are with me, and then 26 more words. Also, it should be noted that the divine name, Yahweh itself, forms a bit of an inclusio in that it begins the psalm and ends it. So you have the Lord, or Yahweh is my shepherd, and then the very last line, I will dwell in the house of Yahweh forever. Those are the only two uses of the divine name in that psalm. And they flank, as he puts, the number 26 flanks the center of Psalm 23, which is you are with me. It's symbolically stating what is plainly stated in the text itself. Okay, so all that stuff is interesting, but what does that have to do with the genealogies? Well, we're going to find divine numbers in the genealogies in interesting places. Now, remember earlier I said that Abraham was 20 generations from Adam. So that would mean Isaac is 21. Jacob, here we'll now go with this genealogy, is 22. Levi, 23, 24, 25. So the 26th generation from Adam is the generation of Moses and Aaron. And this isn't the only 26 associated with them. In fact, if we click out here and go to the text itself, if you were to count up all of the names, which I've actually done, and obviously you skip any names that repeat, you would find that the 26th name in this list in Exodus 6:14, the genealogy of Moses and Aaron, is Jochebed or Jochebed. Let me click out to her name. So this is the mother of Moses and Aaron. She's the 26th in this list, and her name means the Lord is glory, which is a bit of a tautology. It's basically saying 17 to 17 or 26 to 26. Right? That's her name, and she's the 26th in this list. Now, Labuschagne is going to point out a lot more that is going on in this particular section of this genealogy. For example, the genealogy itself is 182 words, which is 7 times 26. Even on the letter level, it's 731, or 43 times 17. Again, you have other 17s. Now here, he points out that there are 43 names altogether, or 43 male names specifically, which is 26 plus 14. And then he makes a statement, among which the name Moses figures as the number 26 in this range. Now, I've done the counting, and the 26th is Jochebed, Moses' mother. But what he did here, and I don't know why exactly, but here he has boxes on all the male names. Now, Jochebed is not a male, so she would drop out. But that would mean Aaron's the 26th. So for whatever reason, I'm not sure, maybe because it's referring to the nation here, this is Israel, and he doesn't include it in there. But that makes, if you take Israel out, you don't count Israel or Jochebed, again, because she's a female, then you end up with Moses being the 26th figure, which I think is justified in doing this because 17 from Moses, as he points out, is Phineas, who terminates the list, basically, is the last name in that list. Now, there's more interesting things that are going to happen. He points out here that you have Levi, Kohath, and Amram are given ages in here, and then later you're going to get Moses and Aaron's name. And if we look at the ages provided, we have 137, 133, 137, 123, and 120. Together, those make up 650, which is 25 times 26. Now, this isn't the only place that you have a list of names and their ages, and it has a divine number embedded in it. Here you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their ages are pretty interesting in their totals because you have this quadratic thing going on. So you have 5 times 5 times 7 is Abraham's age, 175. 6 times 6 times 5, 180, Isaac. 7 times 7 times 3 is Jacob's. Now, if you take those numbers that we multiplied to get their total age, and you add them, though, rather than multiply them, you get 5, 5, 7, 17. For Isaac, 6 plus 6 plus 5, 17. Jacob, 7 plus 7 plus 3 equals 17. But it's also interesting because Joseph's age, 110, is related. So as Labuschagne points out, the sum of the quadratics of his ancestors is Joseph's total, 110. So you have 5 squared, you have 6 squared, then 7 squared times 1 is Joseph's age. And the sum of the total of them, 612, is also a multiple of 17. It's 36 times 17. He also points out how Sarah's name, or age rather, can help you get to one of these divine numbers as well. Another one worth pointing out is Genesis 47, or actually, it is 47, but it's the end. So I have a note here on it, but this is Genesis 47:28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. But what Labuschagne points out here is that, first off, this verse here, verse 28, is actually 17 words. But if you subtract the 17 years in Egypt, That is, outside of Egypt, he lived 130 years, which is 5 times 26, the other divine number. And this goes back to what I've been saying, what I think is kind of a check and balance to the Gomatria type stuff. What it would be saying here through the numbers is that God was with Jacob 130 years, 5 times 26. But God was also with Jacob when he went into Egypt as well. So God was with Jacob his whole life, essentially, which the text itself is basically saying. And I can't help but point this out since we're right in the immediate context. I remember reading an interesting article. I don't remember who wrote it though, but he points out that this is Jacob or Israel at this point. He says his blessing Joseph, his son, and Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. And it's a very difficult phrase to translate. But what this article was suggesting is that Israel actually bowed down to Joseph. He's like passing on he's making him the patriarch essentially. And he said that this final phrase could be rendered, he bowed down to the head of the tribe. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the genealogy, with the sons being heads of the fathers. I couldn't help but point that out because that does actually dovetail with what we've been talking about here. But these are not our only 26s. In 1 Chronicles 26, if we were to count these names, you'd get to Jehozadak, who's the one that, he's the last one. He is the one that went into exile. And he is the 26th in this list of names. But you also have some pretty interesting things happen here, where here we can look at it in chart form, and you'll find that the 14th, there we are with the number 14 again, is David's. So Zadok is the 14th in this line. So Zadok was the 14th, and he was David's priest. Abiathar also served as high priest, but he had his role taken away when he backed the wrong son, basically. He didn't back Solomon. But here you can continue counting up and you get to Jehozadak. I did also want to note, though, not to make too much of it, but Solomon his high priest was Azariah. Now, it would have been nice if that was the 17th, but he's the 18th. But even that's kind of interesting because 18 is associated with Jesus. Watch the other video I made, and I talk a little bit about that. So not to go into that too much, but just noting that Solomon's high priest was the 18th. If memory serves, he was the first one to serve in the actual temple. So just kind of interesting. And we have at least one more list with the 26 in it, and these were the men that came over to David after Saul had died. And if we were to count these names up in this list, we'd get 26. So he had 26 helpers. And you have that term, help, show up a lot throughout this passage. And just briefly, I want to touch on a couple of points from James Bijan, who has he had an interesting Twitter thread on the genealogies. By the way, Bijan was the one that noted the 26 in Jochebed, that she used the 26th in the line. And here he had a really nice thread. I'll link to it because it's well worth reading the whole thing and the rest of his stuff. He does great work in this area, in these kinds of areas. And he states, just as 3 bulls face each point of the compass, so, with the exception of Benjamin, which we'll come to later, the chroniclers' genealogies are arranged on the basis of their location in the land. Of course, he's referring to the outside of the temple. You had this structure, and it mirrors the way that the chroniclers' genealogies go. It kind of mirrors the image that you get in the temple or outside of the temple. But it moves in a southeast, northwest type movement. And note here that you have the chapters moving down again. So normally you just read it, but you wouldn't really notice that it is moving in the southeast, northwest type movement. But notice here that puts Levi in the center. So as Bijan states, the Levites are hence depicted as a kind of tribal laver, since their job is to keep Israel clean. Meanwhile, the Kohathites form a kind of menorah. The text of chapter 6, 1 through 15, describes the Kohathites' central stem branch, while the text of 6:54 through 60 describes their distribution throughout 6 other genealogies cities, i.e. throughout the cities in the tribes branches of Judah, Benjamin, and Manasseh. He makes a note down here that this menorah shape only emerges because of the quirks of chapters 2 and 8's structure, where Judah and Benjamin are doubled up. So you have Judah show up twice and Benjamin show up here and at the end. And so therefore we end up having a 3 plus 1 plus 3 structure. And that puts Aaron's line in the middle and gives us this menorah shaped thing. I was going to go on to point out how a menorah is Levitically significant for other reasons. A menorah has 22 flowers, which is distinctly a Levitical number, since the Levites' original head count comes to 22,000 in Numbers 3:39. Appropriately, therefore, the number 22 is ingrained in chapter 6's literary structure, since each of its sections is patterned around the number 22. And here are the examples he gives. The central stem of 6:1 through 15 consists of a 22-man genealogy from Eleazar to Jehozadak. Chapter 6, verses 16 through 32, segmented genealogy enumerates a total of 44 named individuals, 22 times 2, a count which only amounts to 44 due to the Masoretic text's omission of Joel's name in 6:28. And chapter 6, 33 through 48's genealogies span 22 Levitical generations from Levi to Heman, and chapter 6, verses 49 through 53 enumerates a selection of 11 of Aaron's sons, 11, of course, being half of 22. He goes on to talk about the tabernacle's cover and how it had the 50 loops and whatever, and how this actually also is mapped over the genealogical information here in Chronicles. But I'll leave that to you to read in his Twitter thread, which I encourage you to check out. And so while these genealogies just seem so dry most of the time, there's actually quite a bit that's packed into them, even just on a structural level. A lot more could be added and talked about, but I don't want to make things too long here. But I mostly just wanted to hit on some things that I just don't see brought up a lot or enough. They really only pop up when a specialist is talking about some of these things specifically. And so now that I've talked about the genealogies, I feel like I can talk about the rest of Chronicles. And so I look forward to maybe making some videos about that. Just the things that I find interesting so far in the book that I've studied. And so since the genealogies serve as something of an introduction to Chronicles, this will be kind of my introduction to the book of Chronicles, just an overall observance of some of the things you find in the genealogies throughout the Bible. And hopefully some of this information you'll find useful. And I'll see you guys later.